should be, but yeah. My sentence when you're done, after the matching, it should give you a representation of which groups matched. Right. But when you match, if you best match, there's no maintainers in populates. Well, true, but it's not even populated after a match. So, using that for a match. So I use it all the time.
Right.
You know, implementation.
Trying to get projected.
Yeah, okay.
Have there been problems before in this room?
Yes.
Ah, how comforting. There's a light blinking, but does it mean it's off or on?
Undecided.
Undecided. Okay. So please have a seat. It's getting on.
Nice to see you.
Yes.
You can get
Absolutely.
whether it's
Yep. No. Although if we're talking about messaging, we have a source into this. So I will just wing it. Bear with us for them to fix the projector. So this talk is about the messaging paradigm, the unloved paradigm. And given that this is a fairly full room, actually, obviously I called it that on purpose, because most people equate FHIR with REST. And you know, it's this famous slide with the 4 boxes on it, where you have the 4 different paradigms. And then you look at the REST standard and it only, alright, the FHIR standard, you say that. And you go like, oh, it's only about REST. And it's not. It's just like some people also equate FHIR with, well, that's a repository standard. This defines how my database should look like. Well, that's not the primary intent. Yes, FHIR is about interoperability, but it supports all of those interoperability paradigms, not just services and REST, but also messaging. And messaging is relatively old-fashioned, but it's still around, and it's still used for billions of messages also in healthcare. You've heard it talked by the Catalogue on success context version 3 messages for you, but messaging is the name of the game. Because you simply cannot assume, when we talk about messaging, that these systems are even known to each other. We have an element of loosely coupled systems when we talk about messaging. I may not actually know how to reach the source, or may not know how to reach the destination. So REST is pretty much out of the question. There may be a legacy system over there that does not even have the capability to respond to a query at all. So REST is simply not an option in that particular context. So loosely coupled is one of the core characteristics of the messaging paradigm. And it's trigger event based. So there's always some business reason that triggers the exchange of data. And that may be the simple reason that the patient has been admitted, or it could be some other business reason that causes the necessity of the exchange. And we have an answer paradigm. In that sense, we talked about acknowledgements already when joking about the cable. So when you exchange a message, then it's always acknowledged by some form of response. And that response could be the response to a query I'm using a query message. But much more important than that if I have a message that, for example, orders the receiver to do something, that I get an acknowledgement whether or not they have to do so. So loosely coupled and acknowledgement paradigm are certainly two of the characteristics of messaging. No acknowledgement yet. Okay. And we have, when we do exchanges, then certainly those have to support both synchronous as well as asynchronous exchanges. Now, especially if we look at REST, then obviously synchronous is the name of the game. I shoot some data at you and I get an immediate response, HTTP code or something. But when we talk about classic messaging, then asynchronous is the name of the game. And this is back to the loosely coupled systems. So I send my message somewhere, and it maybe goes via 5 intermediaries, and it may actually take a while for it to get there, and the response may take a while to get me. So that's why we have to support both synchronous as well as asynchronous as part of the messaging paradigm.
You're doing a beautiful job illustrating without illustrations, let me just say.
Yeah.
Apologies for that.
The previous speaker. Which means I move to another characteristics of messaging, which is, what is the purpose of my message exchange? I told you it's based on a trigger event. There is some cause, some business reason for having to send this. And those roughly fall in 3 categories. And the widest known and most often implemented category for message exchange is the notification. Something has happened in my system that causes the necessity for me to send information to some other party to allow them to update, to synchronize their database with my information. Now this is probably, when you look historically at other messaging paradigms in the family of standards, then this is 90% of all data exchanges when we talk about messaging. The other one, and that's much closer to what people tend to do in REST, is the query mechanism. So you send a query and you want to get hold of the latest, the current status of the information. What are the lab results for patient Smith? That's an example of the second mechanism, the second reason, more or less, why you would do a message exchange. And the last one is a category known as message of consequence. So this is a message that is exchanged because you want the receiver to do something. This actually has a certain consequence in terms of activities that the receiver has to perform. Famous example, you send a order to the laboratory system. You want that laboratory order to be performed. So these are the three different categories, formerly known as the message of notification, a message of currency about the current information, it's a query mechanism, and the message of consequence, I want you to do something. Okay. So to revisit the trigger events. The trigger events, if you start looking at FHIR standard, then the FHIR standard has a predefined set of trigger events, which has been admitted, new laboratory result, that sort of stuff. However, if you look at the current list of trigger events as present in the standard, it's a very smallish list. That list by far is not complete yet. And that's partially because we're still waiting for more people to implement the messaging paradigm. And the current list is not specific enough, so there is some work ahead of us to fix that particular thing. Related to the trigger events, there is an issue around this notification mechanism that is used by 90% of all messages. Because a trigger event could be, here's a list of all the known allergies. And you send that to another system to allow them to update their database with the list of all known allergies. And the next day, you decide, from a clinical perspective, that one of those allergies actually wasn't correct, so you just remove it from the list. And you send a new notification. But the notification is not, I just removed an allergy. The notification, the trigger event is, here's a list of allergies. Okay? So suddenly now one is gone. But it's up to the receiver to more or less detect the fact that this allergy is now gone. There's always a backup option. Okay, so this is one of the core issues when we talk about messaging, or one of the core problems is, I'm sending you a snapshot. This is the set of information that's known to me. And it's up to the server, up to the receiver to decide what they're going to do in terms of processing. You sent me 4 allergies yesterday, you're sending me 3 today, which means I have to detect that an allergy is now gone. So there are some special processing rules around this snapshot concept that you have in messaging. For the rest, I need a bit of illustrations.
Yes.
You are interested.
No, it's ready. Let's unswitch.
Maybe we can do a question. How would you relate the concept of that notification to descriptions in the REST paradigm?
Well, it depends on what you subscribe to. If you would subscribe to all allergy intolerances, then you would maybe be able to detect that the allergy was gone. The problem in this case is again, and I will skip some slides. I'll get back to that one. Okay, so messaging, loosely coupled, trigger event based, we talked about that. It's always going to be request response, and messaging does not define the transport protocol. So whether you're going to do messaging over SOAP or messaging using HTTP or whatever, it's basically agnostic as a paradigm to how to transport. If we look at the structure of a message, then it's modeled in FHIR as a bundle. A bundle of a specific type, a bundle of type message. And the bundle resource has as one of its first entries a message header resource. And the message header contains references to the sender and the receiver, and has a source and destination in terms of software applications, and it identifies the trigger event that causes the necessity to exchange this message bundle. A message is always about looking at the trigger event. When I have the trigger event, a new laboratory result, then the core of my message is going to be a couple of focal resources. So my trigger event is a direct indication of a relationship to certain resources that are the focus of this trigger event. New laboratory result, and obviously the focus is going to be the resources that carry that particular lab result. There are also non-focal resources, in the sense that those may be supportive or additional information on top of the resources that we have in the focus of our messages, but they're additional. And this is useful. For example, think of a laboratory message. You think current observations, but quite often from a clinical perspective, you want to also convey the old observations to, for example, do a comparison. The old ones would be here. They're not the focus of this trigger event. And the new observations would be here. New lab result, new observations here, the old ones would be there. So having this focal aspect is very important in messaging. Synchronous. Asynchronous, we talked about that. Definitely asynchronous is the name of the game in quite a lot of messaging environments. 3 different types of exchanges, we spoke about that. That has a bit of impact as to whether you should process the message twice. If you receive the same information twice, is it actually harmful to perform the activity related to the message twice? And obviously when we talk about the lab order, we don't want you to perform the order twice. So there are some consequences as to how to deal with these messages. I talked about the trigger events and that it's a fairly small list at this point in time. And some of these trigger events are overly broad currently. For example, there is a trigger event known as admin notify. Something has changed in some administrative resource. That's a bit too wide in scope, I can tell you. That's not going to do. So we'll need to have a bit more detail on that compared to some other. Because we want to have trigger events historically that identify not just the new status, for example, of a particular resource, but also a trigger event that identifies the status that we're coming from. For example, if you have a status change on an encounter, a patient encounter, and the state change goes from cancelled to active, then that has different business consequences than when it goes from, what do I know, pre-admit to active. So you need to know both statuses, what's the status of the resource that we're coming from, as well as the status of the resource that it's going to. Well, we talked about the list of known allergies issue. So there is a general snapshot issue around the use of messaging. And that doesn't really fit that well. The problem with your question is, how about subscriptions? Well, in your subscription, if we compare this to messaging, you would have to involve or include the source system as well. Let's say I'm listening to 2 legacy systems that support messages. one sends me a list of allergies, the other one also sends me a list of allergies. But when I receive an update from one of those systems, then it's only concerning the list of allergies as known to them. So I have to compare the latest list that I receive to the list that I received from them yesterday, not from the other system. Okay. So there is a bit of a hairy issue here related in this case to provenance. Where's the source of this element? Where they come from? Illustrated here, and the safest way is to rip and replace. So each and every time when I receive this message with these allergies, I go like, okay, so you're the sending system. What I'll do is first delete all allergies that I know that have been sent by you, and then create new resources for the new list of allergies. The problem being is that most of these, at least when you look at legacy systems, most of these allergies resources don't have a unique identifier. Okay. So they're fairly unidentified, so I have no other option than to rip and replace effectively, if an allergy is going to be removed. Queries. So what if you want to fire off a query using the messaging paradigm? Well, it's a bundle, it's a trigger event, it's a query trigger event, and it has the parameters resource as the body. It's the focus, if you want, of this message type. And just like in the REST environment, we have query parameters that have a name, have a particular data type, etc. So we can provide the normal query parameters that we have across all parameters. There is a subscription mechanism if you want to subscribe to messages. And this is new, so we didn't have this in version 2 or version 3. We didn't have a real good subscription mechanism. It was there, but heavily underused. But here we have a generic mechanism that allows you to subscribe to something. And obviously, if you want to subscribe to a message, you send a message to some system that you have a desire to subscribe to messages of a particular that fulfill certain criteria. Okay, so messaging is nice, but now for the conformance aspect. Because we all know, without a conformance aspect, FHIR is more or less equal to version 2. Okay? Even easier to implement than that. But we have to get better in terms of conformance. So, a message has an associated contract. And mostly it's the trigger event, that's mostly the name or the identification of the contract. There is an expected behavior of the receiver when we send a certain trigger event. When I send to you a patient discharge, if we use that as an example trigger event, then I'm expecting you to act upon that information. And this is highly contextual. It could be when I send this to some system that they know that, okay, so this means no more food is to be delivered to that bag when I send it to a kitchen system. But it could also mean when I send it to a different system that I have different business expectations, because some other systems may then decide, okay, so for me that means I have to start cleaning the room because the patient is no longer there. Okay. All of that is more or less implicit to the structure of the message, but it is kind of in the contract between that specific sender and that particular receiver. So, business expectations. So how to respond and what to do, all of those things are part of the definition of that message. Now if we look at one of the conformance resources, okay, we're now going down into the profiling, then this is message definition. And message definition has the things that you already heard about. The trigger event, what's the trigger event type? What's the category? Is this a query? Is this a message of consequences? Is this a message of notification? What's the focus in terms of resources? What should be in there in terms of total resources? Is there a required response, Boolean? And if so, what are the allowed responses in terms of messages? situation where if you send a message, like famous example, perform this pregnancy test on a male person, that the receiver may have the option to send you back a message, yeah, I understand and I promise to do so, it's good for revenue, right? Or they send you back a message that goes like, nah, I'm not going to do that because that's sort of fairly nonsensical to perform that. So a message may have multiple potential responses. So if you look at these conformance resources, again, a simplified overview, then this is the overall capability statement as published by a server. And as part of that capability statement, it talks about 0 to star messaging definitions. And then we have an endpoint with the transport protocol. And it identifies the support for messages, either as a sender or the receiver. And then it points off to the message definition, the thing that we just saw. What are the trigger events? What focus do they have? Focal resources may occur, min-max cardinalities. And each of those resources, again, has a structured definition. And in a message, given that it's a bundle and the resources are all pointing to each other in some way, we can define a formal graph definition. So we can even mandate that if you send a laboratory message, then there shall be this lab observation resource and an author resource and this resource and that resource, and they shall be linked in a particular fashion. So I can formally describe the structure of the message. Now there is something in FHIR known as the composition. And if you have followed other talks, then you will know that the composition resource is mainly used in the FHIR document paradigm. It's kind of the document header that sits above individual resources that represent the sections, more or less. However, you can also use this in a message to simplify the message structure. Because this is the classic message structure that you've seen before. A header, a body that consists of all sorts of resources that are somehow interlinked. But expressing the conformance here is relatively tricky. You have to use this graph definition resource, and that's not the easiest one to implement or to validate whether or not a message meets that graph definition. So instead, you could simply redefine the message to be the message header is associated with a composition, and the composition only has outbound references to the various resources. And that means that my validation is more or less a simple tree structure, and that's much easier to validate. So this could be one of the reasons for including a composition in a message. Sounds strange, but
There's a question about the graph. Does it mean that you remove the patient and also reference?
no.
So they'll still have to be there.
They will still be there, but they may not necessarily be validated, whether they are present or not.
So they become kind of optional in the context of the message.
Yeah. Whether that's a good idea or not, I'm not telling you, but these are some thoughts.
Yeah.
This is a radical new thought, so this needs more thinking as to how you would use that and what the circumstances
No,
are.
that was my question.
We were having conformance in HSM pretty cool with application roles, right?
Yes.
In messaging. So in here we can see that this is like anonymous sender and receiver we cannot register, right? In version 3 implementation we can have specific application role. They have corresponding conformance capabilities and then they were exposed for messaging. So in here there is no such mechanism for that purpose, right?
Well, you would do that at the capability statement level. Because at the capability statement level you would make a statement as to what messages you support as a sender and as a receiver. So whether we're talking about IHE actors, or application roles in version 3, or support for subclasses in DICOM. Those are all similar mechanisms, but they will be dealt with at a capability statement level in FHIR.
And the implementation of this one will be out of the REST paradigm. You have to implement by your own, right? Or
Well, all that I'm telling you is totally agnostic as how you transport things. But I'm purposefully ignoring the REST as an example in this presentation. You could, but it's just a transport, just like smoke signals, or I don't care. Who cares about REST? It's just a transport. Right? So projects. There are some production implementations, obviously, of messaging. It's early days yet, and like with all examples, they're always hard to find, although afterwards, when you talk to people, you hear a lot of examples. So in Canada, there are some examples around using mailboxes. Okay. Mailbox approach, where a central, but they cannot always reach the destination. They have another project that is for the submission of immunization records. And in this case, that message goes to a central repository. Somebody does some QAing on the data, and then they decide to use a subset or use the entire message or not. So in that sense, it makes sense to submit kind of a bundle type of approach. So in NHS England, Richard has just told us in the previous talk in the main room, again, it's a mixture of messaging, REST and documents. And to me, that makes perfect sense if you're in a big environment, national-wide scale, and you already have lots of legacy stuff. You simply cannot assume that all systems will support REST. Be online 24/7 a day. Be available for querying. I mean, how many mainframes do we still have out there that do not support querying? You have to be realistic, it doesn't fit. But even if you leave the question of legacy aside, there are still use cases where messaging is the most appropriate paradigm. REST has some volumetric concerns, because I can either send you a laboratory message that includes 50 resources, or by means of subscription, I find out, hey, there's a new laboratory result, and I start pooling 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 50 different resources via REST. So instead of, let's say, 5 million messages a day, I will now have 5 times 250, 250 million RESTful calls. Imagine the potential overhead of that. I actually don't want that. So, push, here's a new lab result, that's actually much better to do it using messaging. Whereas, if I'm going to query for the latest information, give me the latest address of patient Smith, use REST in that context. But if I'm just sending notifications, messaging is probably a better way of dealing with that than REST. So legacy applications, certainly not queryable, not available, no assumption of client orchestration. That's one of the characteristics of REST. With messaging, you leave the decision what to do, what to use to the server. And if they choose to totally ignore the information that you're sending them, that's fine. That's entirely up to the server. And that goes against the REST, because in REST, the client gets to determine what happens. So to summarize, we have our 4 interoperability paradigms. We have REST, certainly, lightweight, client-driven, single resource in principle. We have documents, I'm not going to talk about that, but that's all about persistence and attested content. And we have messaging, event-driven, behavioral expectation. I'm expecting you to do something. It's sort of implicit in our contract. Request response has an async option. Server-driven orchestration. Stuff other than CRUD, probably much more complex operations, if you want, because an operation in REST would be sort of the equivalent of a trigger event in the messaging paradigm. And the unit of work is multiple resources. And then finally, services, the 4th paradigm. Okay, stuff other than CRUD. There are some rather complex workflow use cases that cannot be covered using documents messaging or REST. And then you end up in the services space, but that's very few exceptions. Now, if you want to, and you're in the services space already, then obviously in services you can mimic the behavior of REST, of documents, or of messaging. So it could do potentially all of the above. So, I hope to have shown you that some of these statements that we have out there, okay, like, oh, messaging, old-fashioned. Nobody uses that nowadays. Well, you're wrong. There's probably more messaging. I'm just going to make a bold statement. There's more messaging in this world in healthcare than there is REST. I don't see any disagreements. You're a messaging right? Nobody uses this. Well, it's pretty early days. We have some production use already, and I think over time we're probably going to find more. Because I think the approach from the Canadians and like the English NHS, that's the most realistic one. It's going to be a mixture of messaging, REST, and documents. We just have to make sure that we have the right fit for whatever problem we're trying to solve. But it's not going to be just REST, or just documents, or just messaging. And we also hear, well, REST can also do this. I will send a bundle using REST. Yeah, well, there is some stuff around business expectations, asynchronous, and some other aspects where that really doesn't work or fit into. So, loosely coupled, that's definitely, if you have a use case where senders and receivers are loosely coupled, messaging is certainly a serious candidate. Story forward architecture, server-driven orchestration, server gets to decide what to do with the data. Event-driven behavioral expectation, always request response, asynchronous. Main characteristics, messaging HIR. Now, because of the snafu with the projector, you didn't actually get to see my initial slide, which had Fred Flintstone on it, because it was an old-fashioned paradigm, and I'm going to end with another picture from Hanna-Barbera. Okay, these are the Jetsons, which is already 50 years old. So predicting the future is always hard. Yes, question?
Hey, is there any initiative for blockchaining messages?
Good question. I have no answer to that. Maybe you can tell me. Drop me an email. Well, Graham is in the back of the room and he's actually raising his hand. So.
Yeah, just wondering if how you can securely aggregate objects to a message. Let's say you have a transaction that will cross many organizations, and you want to add information to that regarding a patient treatment, let's say. So how you secure that? Blockchaining is an alternative for that, but I haven't seen anywhere any initiative about applying blockchain technology to FHIR messaging.
I don't think we're going to get a 1-minute answer to that.
Yep.
Graham is volunteering back in the room, so
There's
you
some
can give it a
people-
shot. 1 minute.
There's some people very interested in blockchain and FHIR, although increasingly they're moving away from putting resources into blockchain. If you're interested, there's a blockchain channel on chat.fire.org where the blockchain discussion hangs out with the skeptics and the blockchain lovers, and so you're all welcome to join in that, but there's never been any talk about messaging in that context.
So what we need is obviously more talk about messaging. Okay, if we are all real-world implementers, then hopefully you will realize we're going to end up with a mixture of all paradigms. There's no way to avoid that if you're doing any large-scale implementation. Okay? So yes, it's a bit underused. It's the unloved paradigm, but I love you and I think. All right.